Alan, are you there?
Yes, I am, yeah.
I can't believe the difficulty we had this morning.
It's pretty standard.
I mean, it was so odd. I'm dialing the number that, it's saying it's out of order, and I forwarded it to the program director. I said, could you figure this thing out? And between my computer and her computer, the number changed.
Really? Yeah, okay.
That's weird.
Yeah, well, I picked up the phone when I realized it was after 10 past, and to phone you, and I had there's someone else on the phone, and I hadn't dialed anywhere, and it didn't ring here,
I think they're trying to put the squeeze on us, Alan.
Yeah, it's pretty common.
They're watching us everywhere, aren't
Well, they are, yeah.
Now, I've been telling folks you were one of the foremost experts, historian and researchers on the secret societies and Illuminatis, and you go all the way back to the beginning of dirt on this stuff.
Yeah, you have to. It's not a recent thing to control vast populations of people. It's been recorded from ancient times and taught to the high courts of kings and queens down through the ages. And it simply got much, much bigger and more refined when it went into large governments with bureaucracies and secret services like the CIA and these kinds of things. So society has always been planned ahead of time, because those in power literally plan the future. They don't want to lose control, but they must convince the public that they're on the cutting edge of evolution with each generation, and it never dawns on them then that every major thing that happens in their life has actually been planned ahead of time. That's why it works so well.
The earliest mind control guy, was it Nimrod? Or, I forget.
It goes back even further.
Okay.
It depends even whose histories you take. Because in India probably has the oldest histories in their archives, because every country has archives as opposed to public libraries.
Governments like to keep records.
They do, because if something works and a formula works, then you never change the formula, but you don't want the public to know that you have the formulas, because even Plato himself talks about the techniques of creating cultures for whole peoples and whole countries, and how it was well understood in his day, and how nothing would be allowed to happen in the culture that would upset the dominant minority, the rulers, and therefore the dominant minority had to employ great thinkers, great philosophers, and people within academy to always update and help modify the culture from the top down. Yeah, and that's what we've had mainly in this. It was great to live in the 70s and the 80s and watch the tail end of the pop rock culture, and how it was really pushed from the top by multi-billionaires, really. It wasn't a grassroots thing at all.
We always think it's our idea, don't we?
We do. Yeah.
Now, one of the best ways to control civilization, and I've always suspected this, was through an omnipresent God. If you're not going to be around government controls, so you're going to live out in the country or whatever, well, there's always that fallback thing that, there's a God watching you, and so you just better go ahead and pay your taxes. And I think the early kings or the Masons or the echelon, I guess, the elites, figured this out, that, hey, to keep these people in line and not overthrow me, one, they got to think I'm connected to the gods, or I am a god myself, and I'm everywhere, and you can't overthrow me because I'm here to protect you. I'm a wonderful guy, and protect you from invasion. But you guys got to pay attention, and that way you won't kill me when I come and ask for your gold.
Yes, and that came even. The structure existed before the days of Sumer. There's no doubt about that. The Sumer really was a sort of, I would call it, more modern prototype of the present-day society. And they obviously had the knowledge from previous civilizations, the Hurrian civilization that existed before that. So we're going back 10,000 years, 15,000 years.
Now, it just seems so hard to wrap your hands around a dynasty or families that can stay in power behind the scenes and control nations, control money supplies, control wars, control famines. And it's like, no, people really aren't that evil. Or how come they haven't interbred, and how come we're not seeing this?
Yes, and that's the technique again. Kings and queens always had front people to speak for them. It's no different from today. Today we have governments to speak really for an elite. And we're taught to believe the governments are in charge. So the governments take the heat off the real rulers. That's the job of the frontmen. And Britain always had a chancellor or something before that for a king, and he would take the heat for all the decisions that were made because the king was above all of that, you see. He was a nice guy, and it kept him a nice guy. So that the chancellor would take the heat. So it's the same thing in all ages. Today we have a better cover called democracy in most of the countries. And democracy is a favorable thing. Plato talked about it in 2,300 years ago. He said this system, this perfect utopia for the elite, the guardian class he called them, will use a form of the republican democracy. And because democracy, you can always count that 80% of the people will do what the elite want them to do, and therefore they'll pretend it's majority rule. But 80% will do what they're told to do. That's what it really meant.
It's so obvious today. I mean, there was just a vote in our U.S. Senate yesterday. I think it was 99-0 about basically reprimanding Iran and saying, if you continue to fund bad guys over there, we're not going to like it. And he's like, no debate. It's like they turned on the mist machine and they all went to sleep, or they're all under some sort of gigantic mind control. And I thought, well, that's the most worthless bill or stupid thing I've ever heard in my life. And it's a 100% vote?
I know. And this is the thing, too. We've got to realize that there's consensus behind the scenes through societies within government. All major politicians, if they've stayed in government for more than one term, even in the lower ranks, they're allowed into a higher parallel rank where they're told part of the agenda and they must agree to abide by the rules of the decisions made by their superiors. And so they vote the way they're told to vote. Professor Carl Quigley, wrote about this in his book Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American Establishment. Now, he was authorized to pick people to be Rhodes Scholars for world government. That was the purpose of the Rhodes Scholarship. So he picked Bill Clinton, amongst others. And he was the official historian for the Council on Foreign Relations, this parallel group that actually they drafted up all the plans for the American integration, this non-governmental organization. And they are simply the American branch of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. That's the British Commonwealth branch. And so it's run from London. And he wrote about this, and he was all for it. He was part of them. He was a member. And he said then in the 1960s in his book, he said the United States government has been run by a parallel government for at least 60 years, and that was in the 1960s.
Wow.
And he talked about the whole agenda. He filled in all the little blank spots of what led up to wars and what was behind them, and admitted that he and his group and other groups that belonged to the same circle worked in concert to bring on these wars. And they laid out the plans for the whole global empire for the future. And it's not just the politicians that they bring in, certain politicians. It's also a vast amount of your higher bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats are more important, and they have been since World War I with the League of Nations.
Now,
because then the bureaucrats have lifelong positions in particular offices and departments, and they bypass the government and go straight to their headquarters, which is now the United Nations.
We're on the air with Alan Watt. You can go to his website at cuttingthroughthematrix.net, and you've got 3 books out right now, or you're a 3-volume set. Cutting through the volumes 1, 2, and 3. It's available for our listeners out here. Go onto his website. You can order it directly. He also has DVDs you'll never think the same. And one of the things we're doing down here, Alan, is that we have embarked on an agenda here at the station. I own it. Mm-hmm. We're a little small station here, but we're the most powerful station in the Northwest up here. That I sense that the time is very, very short, and we have now got to get the information, get the truth out here as fast as possible. And that's one of the reasons we wanted you here on the show, is like, we're trying to lift the matrix that everybody's been under here. And it seems like we're finding out every core belief we've had, or every political thought has been a lie.
Yes, it has. It truly has. I mean, I was discussing with some people about the problems with the Middle East and why it's going on. And I said, you have to go back into the memoirs of British officials, sort of consular generals, people that were put in charge of whole countries that the British Empire set up a long time ago, and read their own memoirs. And you'll find, for instance, that Sir Ronald Storrs, S-T-O-R-R-S, was the lieutenant governor. He was put in charge of the British takeover of the country called Palestine back in the 1920s and 30s in preparation for the creation of a state of Israel.
Yeah,
and what he said in his own memoirs, and it's very flippant for those who don't understand history. It's very important. A little quip, and that's how history is made or missed. He said, "We have set up in the Middle East another Ulster." Now, Ulster in Ireland was set up by London to cause frequent dissension and troubles down through to the present century in Ireland with the Protestants and the Catholics, using religion primarily as a motive of war and eventual takeover. It was to keep a constant pot boiling and simmering that the whole world would feel the effects of. And that's how far back. We're talking 1920s.
I think Samuel Adams said fear is the foundations of most governments.
It is.
And then you hit on something that was very profound for me. It's like governments fear peacetime.
Yes, they do. They admit themselves that the first reason for government existing is to protect the rest of the little people, even in a tribal situation, from those guys over there, across the other side of that pond that you drink out of. And so the biggest guy in the tribe was picked. Now, your problem then is if you start spoiling the big guy and he has to drop back down into your way of living, your standards of living, he might not like it. But at least a tribe could overcome one person, and that's why the tribal system, it was easier. He couldn't get a standing army together until money came along. And also, money was the key to standing armies.
And also the little guy, like we can equate to the middle class, that once you start to gain cash or affluence or spare time, you can do positive things with that, whether you want to run for office or you want to do charity work or start buildings. You become wealthier and wealthier and becomes a threat to them.
It becomes a threat, and that's why people think that and we're all trained. You see, the whole world, when you think of a whole world trained to use this thing called money, which is really a trick, because once they bring money in, they can tax it back from you. And the word tax means to labor. You tax yourself when you labor. Now, they take part of your labor back, then they employ more people, and as long as everyone believes in this money, you can hire armies, whole armies, and police, and think tanks to keep the people dominated. Money is the key to it. Yeah.
I think there was a quote from one of the old Rothschild patriot women that said, "Wars don't start unless my boys want them to start."
That's right. They don't start. I was watching a program two years ago on public broadcasting, and it was about the troubles in Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone, of course, is rich in tremendous minerals and diamonds and so on. And they found out that these companies in Britain primarily and New York, working in tandem, had hired thousands of mercenaries, British and American primarily, to go in there and train the natives to have revolutions in order that they could take over the vast diamond fields there. And they talked to one of the guys at the head of one of these big London corporations of gold and precious metals and diamonds and platinums, and he literally couldn't understand the reporter when the reporter says, "How can you possibly plan something like this and kill thousands of people for money?" And the man looked and he sort of was incredulous. He says, "It's business, don't you understand?" That was his answer. It's business.
Just business.
He said they're sitting on all that land and doing nothing with it. Yeah. So kill them.
Yeah, well, use it for ourselves and exploit it and make them slaves. Now, there's the Rockefellers. I mean, our audience is very much aware of the Federal Reserve Act and the Income Tax Act and how these criminals that ruling families, or the wealthiest families then, basically came in and created their own money supply and own our money supply, and a lot of people are still ignorant about that, but not this audience.
Yeah.
And we've watched the dollar value go from, it's worth a penny today compared to what it was. And Montana, just from the 60s, went from the fourth in per capita income in the nation to dead last right now, because we were a resource-based state here, and what they've all done with our resources. They locked them up, sent them all overseas, and now we import them.
Yeah.
So there's an agenda to destroy America, and I just can't figure what mindset these people have, because America was good to them. They made money, and now, they're like, well, let's merge Canada and Mexico with the United States, and that plan's going on, and the rest of the world's starting to reject this Federal Reserve note, so, we can issue you a new currency.
Mm-hmm.
It's just...
Yeah, all we're living through is a business plan. The whole world is just one big, long business plan. And Karl Marx talked about the unification of the Americas. In the 1850s, he wrote about it. And he said, eventually the world that we are planning. Now, Karl Marx, remember, was employed by the Rothschilds in London while he wrote the Communist Manifesto with a bunch of people, a whole team of people.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just one person who did it. He was a failed journalist, and that's why they hired him, not because of his belief system. And so Karl Marx talked about the unification of the world under a super government, which would come probably in 100 years' time, or to the end of the millennium. And he said there'll also be three main trading blocks. A united Europe will be first, followed by a united Americas, and then followed by a united Pacific region. And that's exactly what they've been working towards.
Now, I think some people may have the misconception, or that there's going to be global governments like, okay, finally we're going to have a place to settle our differences like the UN, or there's going to be a world premier or three premiers, and we'll have this great body of government to run the world. I don't see it that way. I see the shadow government running the world, and the illusion of countries still around.
Yes, the whole thing is to always use nationalism, and this was the key even with communism. Communism was the flip side of capitalism. It was two sides of the same coin. It was a dialectic technique of steering the populations of the world into where they wanted them to be, the big sheep pen. And so the whole agenda was to get the public to use nationalism, first of all, and then through nationalism and wars and conflict, they would come to war weariness, and then they would suggest we amalgamate to end the wars, and then give up your nationalism gradually. The only country really that's had an overdose of nationalism is the United States. The rest of the countries have had the rug pulled from underneath them about 50 years ago, gradually. Because the United States was chosen to be the engine to bring all this about. And as the U.S. is finishing off its main job of standardizing the world in the Middle East, they would gradually bring the U.S. down to the same world standard as everyone else.
I've been warning people that for decades. I said this idea of unions and treaties is not, even though they say it's going to, American exports, American jobs, raise our standard of living. No. It is to lower ours to theirs.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. Morris Strong, for instance, Morris Strong works for he was first started off with Rockefeller. He was chosen and groomed, and he's a big player for the United Nations and big enterprises across the globe. But he also drafted up the Earth Charter, which gives everything else rights except us.
Yeah, along with Mikhail Gorbachev.
And he was asked at the end of the 92 Earth Charter meeting what he meant about the rights of animals, etc. He said, why don't you give humans rights? Now, this is an American who was asking him the question. And he says, you Americans, he says, you'll wish you had the rights of trees by the time we're finished.
Now, you hit on something. I've heard you on other shows do this, and I've listened to quite a bit on your website. And now, for our audience out there, it's cuttingthroughthematrix.net. I encourage you, please buy his DVDs. We can't cover everything here today. Alan, you also do a weekly blurb, I think, on there too, don't you?
I do about 3 generally, yeah.
Okay. So we want to get our audience as acquainted with you as they possibly can through your books, through your DVDs, and through your internet broadcasts that you have on your website there. So if you're just hearing Alan for the first time today, I hope I can, interrupt me and you take over anytime. We got to get in the right direction, Alan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, you hit on something about America's democratization of the Middle East or standardization over there. Explain a little bit what the future and the plan is for the United States, because a lot of people need to hear this. And if I can pick up that this was all planned about us going in there decades ago.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's something that's supposed to happen to us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can go back even to as I say, the main societies that stuck their head up. They probably always existed under one name or another, but they put their head up in the 1800s. And that was when the big push to really forward the Darwinistic theories came along, which was to dispel all ideas of the old gods and old religions and bring in a scientific dictatorship type of system where we would be trained by experts and we would believe the experts the way we used to believe what priests said. And that has happened. And it was Professor Thomas Huxley, who was the best friend of Charles Darwin, who picked certain people to be authors that would be made to be famous, like H.G. Wells in the 1800s. And he predicted the whole setup for the 1900s. They talked about creating a system of free love to destroy the last vestiges of the tribal system, which was marriage between man and wife, and how they would separate the children from the adults, and the state would bring up the children under a scientific formula where the children would become basically almost robotized wards of the state. They would do what they were told. The whole thing was to dominate what they called inferior types, those with less IQs, and they believed, being Darwinists, that they had the right, because of the superiority of intellect and wealth, to run the planet and direct the planet as they pleased. Their biggest problem were the masses who might object. So they'd have to train the masses in different ways without the public being aware they were being trained, and that their ideas that they would have, their opinions they would hold and even fight for, were not actually their opinions. They'd been marketed right into their minds. And you'll find that's happened today. But they wrote lots of books about this from the top, the main players. Right up through the 1900s, we have many of the major players that helped formulate the system and actually have brought us to where we are today, writing about it in their own memoirs in the early 1900s onwards.
Now,
nobody reads the books.
We always thought 1984 was just a bizarre piece of science fiction fantasy. It seems like every page is coming true today.
Yes, it is, because once again, if you go into the history of the author, and Blair was his name, and he came from a family of high bureaucrats and people who worked for the Home Office and the Foreign Office in the British government. His father, in the 1930s, was the overseer for Burma for the British Opium Corporation. And that came out in Parliament by a politician called Thompson. And because they just found out that they had a department of opium, they didn't know. And when they checked into who owned this opium corporation that the British taxpayer was funding and paying the salaries of all the employees, it turned out to be a crown corporation. It was only the British nobility and royalty that had shares in it.
Oh, okay. Now it seems like heroin and opium production is 5 times higher than before the war started.
Yes, it is.
Now, you said something about the crown, and this is another misconception a lot of people have. They think of the crown, they think of the Queen Mum, and for whatever reason, Americans have been brainwashed thinking that, gosh, if we only had a royal family, like it was pathetic the way this country almost went into mourning or national mourning over Princess Di. Wait, she's not ours. Sorry, get over it. They just long to be subjects or something.
Yeah.
But the crown, people misconstrue that to mean like the monarchy. The crown is a completely separate entity.
It is. The crown goes back into a feudal system where they had their own laws, and they still do have their own laws for royalty and nobility. They cannot be tried in a normal court of law. They must be only tried amongst their peer group. And, of course, they have a different set of rules of things which they're allowed to do, which is pretty well anything at all.
Isn't it true they operate out of the 6-acre area called the City of London, which is basically a separate nation-state?
It has a sovereign status, yeah. And it definitely does have some of their big organizations based there. But, yeah, they live around London and in the areas around London, and they have offices and the second and third and fourth homes within London when they have to go in, all the big players. But we call it in Britain, we call it the establishment. It's always been there.
You know,
it's above government.
One of the stories you've told is what made you wake up. I mean, what set the light bulb go off on this? It was when you were a young man living in Scotland, like after World War II.
Yeah.
The same thing we were promised here, the peace dividend. Oh, once this war's over, we don't need to spend all this money on military. The peace and prosperity will be unbelievable. We're all going to, thanks for sending your kids to die for us. Now, here's the results. We're going to reap the benefits. And that never does happen, does it?
It never happens. In fact, if you, once in a while, here in Canada, they'll show you old reruns or history path news types of reruns going back to before World War II. And there was a big rush then after the League of Nations was signed. That was the precursor of the United Nations. And you saw these British ships dumping thousands of tons of ammunition and firearms into the ocean under the pact they signed then to disarm. And as they were doing that, the same boys who owned the armaments companies were pushing for a second war with Germany so that they rearm all over again. Yeah, but after World War II and before World War II, they said, if we fight this war, and they said the same thing in the First World War, then everyone in Britain will have a home to live in. Because most folk at that time in Britain never owned their own home. It was a foreign concept to the average person in Britain. There's only a small minority who actually owned their own house, and everyone else had to rent. And the wages and incomes and the prices were pretty well manipulated and fixed, so the average person could never save money. That was the way the British system was so rigidly regulated. And so as World War I came along and they were running out of men, and so they said, well, we'll build all these houses for you with your tax money and give you something back for the first time from your tax money if you just fight this war. Well, after the war, it never happened, so they tried the same thing in the Second World War, and then they opened up old condemned buildings to house the people in. I was born in a one-room apartment with 4 people living in the room, and that was way long after World War II.
The peace dividend.
Yeah. and I thought at the time, too, when I started to realize what was happening, before I was 5, I went into libraries because I could read before I went to school. And I looked at books to see all these things about because everyone was still talking about what happened during the war. In 1952, there was still rationing, or 1951, they were still giving ration cards to every British person for food.
Unbelievable.
And so I went into the libraries, and lo and behold, I read this kind of stuff, and I said, how come if Britain is such an old empire, and they fought wars for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they looted all the gold from Spain, and they looted gold from this country and France and so on, how come only a small minority in London and their descendants ever benefited from it? And that was my wake-up call right there.
They are masters at mind control and brainwashing, and I'm a victim of it. I mean, like I said, I'm learning here these last couple of years that just about everything I believed in has been a lie. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's a hot debate in this country is health care. They're going, Hillary care. Oh my God, you're going to turn the thing over to the government? What can the government do right? They have basically turned us against our own government. And now government, according to, the way this country did start off, was we the people. Mm-hmm. We the people. We are the masters of our government. They are subservience to us, and we hire government to do things that we can't individually do, such as build roads, bridges, armaments, defend the country, so on and so forth. When it comes down to, say, health care, it's like, oh, you can't have that. Corporatism's good. Privatization's good. I mean, they're selling our ports. They're selling our public roads. I mean, they've brainwashed us into thinking that everything public is therefore socialism evil, but give it to the capitalist elite, and they can take care of it better for you.
Well, again, that is what Quigley said. Remember, in his own book, Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American Establishment, it was his other book, and he said, we are creating a new type of, a new system, more on the ground, along the grounds of, or the ways of a feudal system, a new feudal system of public-private partnership, which in reality, he said, the CEOs of the big international corporations will be the new feudal overlords.
Now, my understanding of public-private partnership has always been fascism.
Yep. It's more than fascism. What it means really is that the public pays for the building and the maintenance of, and the private part is to reap the profits.
A good example here in this country is our dams. You know,
Yep.
we built these dams out of public funds to provide us cheap, low-cost electricity, and then somehow they all got sold off.
Yeah, and they're doing it worldwide. You must remember that everything that's happening to the United States has already been happening to most of the other countries in the world long before.
Now,
They were the last one to use the same system to be brought into the fold, you see. And you'll find the same company based in London it will end up owning the water rights of the world. Every little pool, a pond, dug well, drilled well, whatever, across the planet will be owned by them eventually, and natural gas.
We've seen it here in Montana already. And, you know, one of the biggest hoaxes is that these super capitalists they're the ones who fund, and they love communism. I mean, communism is their favorite form of government because they only have to deal with one or two entities at the top, and they can control all the masses through a totalitarian regime. But it's unbelievable. And if you look at America and compare it to the Communist Manifesto, we've adopted almost every plank here in this country.
You have. And it was meant to be so because it was a dialectical process. You must create an enemy to terrify the public so that you can tax them even further and experiment with a new type of system which will be brought in globally. And that's why they created the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was heavily funded from New York and London from the very beginning. And even some top players who were lords in the British government system, like Lord Bertrand Russell, he in his own memoirs, he said that he was sent to China back in the 1920s to teach at universities and to teach the beginnings of communism. Now, why would the top capitalists, the British crown and royalty, be sending one of their own brethren, a lord, over there to teach communism? It's only when you go into the histories you realize, no, they created their supposed opposites.
Yeah, and
the synthesis was the reason, because when you create two conflicting systems, eventually you get war-weary. The people want peace. They're terrified of being bombed out of existence, and that was really pushed in the 60s and 70s to terrify everyone. And then you amalgamate the two systems together into the third way. And Plato called it the third way. He says that this is the technique. You create two opposites, warring factions, make the people war-weary, and then blend them into the combination of the two. And that's where you have a fascist elite at the top running things unhindered, and they have a communistic-type bureaucracy running the people in a communistic fashion. And they have written in all their books, all from the capitalist side, that they favored collectivism more than any other form of government for controlling the public. And
that's such an easy sell to an ignorant masses because it promises them something for nothing. We're all going to share the wealth. We're all going to be the same. It's going to be the benefit. No one's going to be richer than others from each according to his needs and all that kind of baloney, which never comes to pass. That's just a sales tool.
I remember when they had decided, I'm sure they probably decided that when they set up the Soviet Union, when they would dismantle it. That's how far ahead they planned everything. And when the so-called Berlin Wall went down, just by chance, of course, and everyone says, oh, that's strange.
Didn't see it coming.
Then I remember reading in a British newspaper, I think it was the Daily Mail, a big picture there of this man coming out of a building with a big bag, and it happened to be a guy, Solomon, who was the chief banker for the Soviet system, who happened to be a cousin of the Rothschilds. And it was a big write-up about a strange concept of this communist country that supposedly didn't use the capitalist system, and yet this Solomon was leaving the Soviet Union with all the loot, billions and billions in dollars, and going back to London.
Wow.
So, yeah, they were completely ripped off.
You know, one of the great mind control things to make people live in fear, and I never could even as a young kid understand this, why would the average Soviet family want to annihilate the average American family? And by keeping our society separate with news blacks out, the communists living, all these people are living under, horrible, and you guys, and whatever stories they told us to them about us, but never did we get together. It was always the sable rattling of our leaders we'd see on TV, and like, oh my God, it's tough. They're going to nuke us, Mm-hmm. And we just blindly follow through with whatever they want us to because of the imaginary bad guy.
And it was the same too with Lord Bertrand Russell. See, Lord Bertrand Russell, while he was promoting this communistic style and free love, he had experimental schools authorized by the Crown back in the 1920s, right through the 50s and 60s. He was still alive. And he was a guy who set up the anti-war movement. And it was him who took the old occultic sign, turned it upside down for ban the bomb. And he ran the Committee of 100. You'll find that in his own memoirs. And the Committee of 100 was the radical side that would storm American bases and smash down the outer perimeter fences. And it was all a show to get big publicity, to terrify everyone of a reality that was never meant to happen. But the psychological impact was to terrify the whole world and to get thousands of people marching for peace and also to give up all their rights in the process.
It's just like when they have the G8 meetings and the planned anarchists are always there to riot, and, they're funded by the same people.
They're funded and coordinated. And I'll tell you one thing, I used to be heavily involved, much bigger than most folk now, so I use different names, and in the music industry for writing and for performing, and also in other ways, even in session work and guitar and so on. And sometimes you go to a country and someone would approach you and says, could you sing at a charity event? And you say, well, sure, And in Canada, I'd come over for a visit at the time. I was living in Norway, and I came over for a visit, and a girl says, would you play at this workers' meeting? I says, well, sure. There was a big function in Toronto, and I sang a couple of songs and sat down. Then I was invited into the back room where the major members came in, and the other players and performers. But also the people who were there were the ones who ran the left-wing movements in the country. And then after that, there was a select few taken even later into the night into another place outside, into an apartment. So there was only about 12 of us there. And because this girl had asked me, she just come along. I went along, and a guy came in who just came over from the Moscow University, just got off the plane. He had been based in California before he went to Moscow University, and he was also English. And he sat and started telling them all of their plans for networking all of the radical groups together, all radical, fundamental, and atheistic groups all together, combine them all, including the homosexual movements and lesbian movements. And I sat and listened to all of this, And I says, well, what is this?
I just came to play a song.
And then, well, the thing was, what got me, and I asked him, I says, well, how come? I says, how come you can, this is during the Cold War. I says, how come you can come from Britain, go and live in California, run the top communist societies in California, go over and study in the Moscow University, and then walk right into Canada and no one bothers you? And that's when he stopped and gave me this strange blank. Nobody had asked him before. It told me that all of the agencies and all of the countries would know him, there's no doubt about it. And he worked for a higher group than any of them, higher than communism. The ones who controlled communism and capitalism. That's why he had a free hand to go anywhere he wanted to.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, I've been fighting the environmental extremist movement here for, 25 years. And these poor working ants at the bottom, the ones that show up, that wear their flannels and go tie themselves to a tree and file the lawsuits. Yep. And the same with the radical lesbian gay movement, the militant part. They don't even realize that they're a creation of the people they hate.
That's right. They don't know. They're all being used. And that's the macabre beauty of this technique. They find people who are on the fringes, who are left out of society, and they give them a form of hope. And they also boost their egos, telling them some of them will even take over and fund them too, and then lead them. And they always use these groups. And once they've used them, they destroy them. They have no personal interest in what you think, what you believe, or your sexual preference or anything else is. They don't care. And you understand, those at the top almost see themselves as another race. They are psychopathic. They're inbred psychopaths. They don't have empathy for ordinary people. They don't have it at all. It doesn't exist in them.
You have to be a psychopath if you think killing 4 billion people is a good idea.
Yes, or even 1,000. You know, I mean,
20 or 2, 1.
These people say the end justifies the means, and they have used this down through the ages to get wars begun, started. They've used covert groups to start the killings and blame someone else. This is a favorite technique down through the ages, you know.
Now, how do you see, I mean, because obviously you've been on the inside and gotten their plans or talked to folks. What is their agenda or the motive, the means on how they're going to exterminate 4 billion of us? I've got some hints, perhaps famine, perhaps the biological bird flu. I don't think nukes, because it's going to mess things up a little bit too much for them.
Yeah, I don't even see. This is the thing too. Down through the ages, they've used all of these methods. Nothing is new. Nothing at all is new. When you look back in old times when they would besiege a castle, and most castles were like city towns with big walls around them, they would cut off your water supply, so they had to own your water. They had to stop food from coming in and wait until you'd used the food within, so you're starving. They used plague because they knew even thousands of years ago that diseases like smallpox, some people became immune when they recovered. They would use those as special troops, companies, and they would fire infected bodies over with ballistas over the walls to inside people and spread plagues, etc. So they'd used all this kind of stuff in past ages. These are standard warfare techniques. Warfare isn't just bang, bang, you're dead. There's many things, including economics.
They used to catapult diseased animals into the fortresses to spread disease among the fort.
Yes, and not only animals, they used humans too. They'd find where the nearest plague was. They'd get the guys who'd had that particular one and recovered, and they would use them to handle the bodies and to fire them over.
Oh, great.
Yeah. You see, they don't even have to do that because they're already training those young children who are growing up now into a whole new belief system, a new reality. Michael Gorbachev, and we forget that he was the president of the Soviet Union. Michael Gorbachev has written books. He now works for the United Nations.
It lives in the Presidio in San Francisco.
Yes, and he has the green cross of the Knights of Lazarus flying outside. They're all knights, you see. Mm-hmm. And he wrote one of his books towards a new civilization, and towards a new beginning. He said, I myself, I'm personally an atheist. He said, then he goes on to say, we, he doesn't say who we are, but he says, we are presently creating a new religion for the general population, which will be taught to the young. It will be based on a form of earth worship. What he meant by that is that through indoctrination of catastrophes, through overpopulation, global warming, all of the terrifying scenarios they can create in the minds of a child, those children will voluntarily allow themselves to be sterilized.
You know,
Mother Earth.
I connected the dots on this all by myself before I even knew any better. I said, there's always been desire for world domination, whether it's through the Catholic Church or Genghis Khan or the emperors of Rome. I said, but there's always been a pocket of resistance somewhere, or there's a slave uprising, or people get tired of it, or they overextend themselves. So they've never had no one's pulled it off yet. And I said, there's one way they can do this. You find the most common enemy that everybody's going to agree with, and then they'll all lockstep go towards it. And I said, it's going to be the Earth. It's like, save the planet. We all have something in common now. Let's all work towards saving the planet, and damn, it's unfolding before our eyes.
Yes, and also, you see, they have many think tanks in a pyramid structure from the top all the way down, working on different aspects of public planning, propaganda, information and so on. And one of their big think tanks is called the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome, the founders themselves published a book called The First Revolution, and it's about the first type of a new type of revolution, but it's called the First Revolution. In there, they talk about how the founders had been told to find ways of uniting the planet, and they discussed invasions from outer space. Could they convince the public to unite, etc., etc.? That might not work. And it says, then we hit upon the idea of using overpopulation and threats to the environment as the very possible thing they could implement and make people believe.
Now, Rothschild's dynasty is the main mover behind the environmental movement. Is that right?
The Rothschild is only one of them.
Okay.
There's about 12 major banking families, but even then, most of the people who really run this world never have their names mentioned in newspapers. They have incredibly large amounts of money, very old dynasties, and they keep out of the public limelight.
Where would you recommend our listeners go to get news? I mean, we've got the internet, obviously. We've got this radio station. But when you look at the mass media, whether it's the magazines, the tellies, other radio stations, cable, satellite, I mean, that is mass hypnosis.
It's incredible. Yeah, repetition. They all see the same things at the same time to get it across to us. And you can't really. What you have to do, because even I mean, most coast to coast even the AM stations like Toronto, all they do is parrot the main news given to them by router and API, and so what you have now is really controlled news, all coming from two sources.
The eye. And
they just parrot the same thing, and the more they parrot it, the more the public thinks it must be true, because everywhere they tune into is saying the same thing.
Yeah.
It's a simple technique to dominate the media.
I challenge a lot of people to debate me, and once they get past their repeated cliches, they're pretty empty.
Yes. And you see, you have to go into people's lives, like we're talking about George Orwell and his father. I mean, he in his own biography, he tells you, he says that his father was in charge of the British Opium Corporation, and then he says, I myself was groomed to work for this same establishment. That's why he was let in on the understanding of the techniques of revolutions and wars to bring us to a future world where terrorism would be everywhere. He knew the whole agenda, and he turned against them after he came back from the Spanish Civil War, when he realized that the communists and all of the other opposing factions at the top were joined at the hip. People down below didn't know.
I think I was listening to Rince the other night, and it was just a good example of how these people stay within themselves. Is that Al Gore's daughter just got married a month or so ago, and she married, he gave the name out, and Rince said, go look it up, and I knew who it was. I can't remember right now. It's JT somebody or Pete, but it was one of the original families that was at Jekyll Island. They said,
yes.
And it's like, damn, they don't get out of the circle much, do they?
They don't. They are incredible. And even Charles Darwin, the same thing. Charles Darwin belonged to some of these secret organizations. His father had brought out a book on the origin of species before he did, because all it was the higher Masonic belief system of evolution coming from slime. It's really Hinduism. You start off as slime and amoebas and work your way up. And his grandfather's book didn't get very far, so they had to make Charles a star, and they built him up to be a star for a whole year in all the media before the public eventually saw his books on the shelves. They made him into a star by saying he was one, over and over and over, and a genius. But Charles Darwin himself only married into one other family, as his father had, as his grandfather had. And the other family was the Wedgwood family that has the big pottery factories and so on. And when Charles's wife died, he married his mother's sister, who was a Wedgwood. They were all Wedgwood, so the Darwins only intermarried for generations into one other family.
Now,
the Wedgwoods.
It's hard for people to believe that they are being hypnotized. I mean, the grid's out there, the matrix is out there, the constant reinforcement every day, and we don't even know what they're dropping on us from the sky. I mean, they like to poo-poo it because somebody discovered chemtrails. Oh, that's that conspiracy wacko stuff. Well, then stop it. Then it's not a big deal.
Well, Rumsfeld, you see, here's the thing. After 9/11, many little quips come across television programs and news stations, which the big boys, or at least the front men, say themselves. And I was watching a little bit on someone else's television, because I didn't have one at the time. I didn't want one. And Rumsfeld was asked, look, if another terrorist attack happens on a major city like this, on a bigger scale, how are you going to stop or control the panic? And he said, we have aerosolized Prozac and Valium ready to spray over large areas when required. And that's when it hit me. I knew they were using aerial spraying to modify the weather and under weather warfare. That's in a treaty that the US and Britain and other countries signed at the United Nations in the 1970s. They would spray the atmosphere with aluminized content, aluminum oxide and other metals, and then use HARP on top of it, because HARP then works better because they can make a better circuit out of the atmosphere by the spraying. But I thought there'd be more to this than meets the eye, because they never do two things or one thing at a time. They'll do multiple things. And it made perfect sense they would also use tranquilizers to tranquilize whole vast populations while they bring us through the greatest changes in history into a completely new way of living.
You know, we say all the time, and most Americans do, how could those people in Nazi Germany been so stupid? Didn't they see what was going on before their eyes? I mean, and we're living through what I believe may be a worse nightmare.
It is worse. It is worse. You've got to be able to jump from where we are as ordinary people and jump into the mindsets of military planners and strategists. And when you see what they plan for the future, and it truly is a completely radically different society than the one we know now. And if it's a planned society, you won't have a child unless authorized. You will serve a world state. And they've said that in all their charters, including the Council on Foreign Relations.
All your information will be censored, even on the internet.
Yeah, and eventually you will have no ability to even think independently as an individual, because they really do mean this, that they're going to take us from computer, which was it was really a conditioning method to get you hooked on something, then to the iPod, then to an implanted chip. And they've had global meetings. They've implanted chips ready to go, which will interface with your nervous system into regional computers. And you can find this at Loyola University, unless they've pulled it in Louisiana, because that's where they had their global meetings on this brain chip. And so it's a training method from computer to get us hooked on it, to the iPod, and then cell phone, etc., right down to a brain chip, and how much more convenient it will be. But once everyone has it, they said at the Loyola World Science Meeting on this particular chipping process, they said once this happens and everyone has the chip, they'll be unable to think of themselves as separate individuals anymore. It'll be impossible to think of yourself. He said, think of it more like the hive. And that's when I thought about the Borg from Star Trek. That's what they're talking about.
You know, and they're here. I mean, because I remember seeing stories about this. You can see how they sell this. Here's a family that's volunteered to take the first chip, and we're so happy. We'll always know where our child is. I'll never lock myself out of my house again. I just swipe my hand, and I'll never have any worries about medical if I'm unconscious. I mean, I'm so grateful you gave this to me. Mm-hmm. And I saw all the networks sell this thing, and you're like, well, here's Mr. and Mrs. Future Couple, and look how happy they are because they've taken the chip.
That's right, and they also have companies now which are really fronts for the NSA, because the guys who head them admit they're NSA ex-employees, chipping youngsters, teenagers for like the Badger clubs, nightclubs across the world. They have them in Holland and Spain and elsewhere, where they chip you in the arm as a passive chip.
Whoa.
But they can actually put your ID in there and put a whole bunch of credits in there that you pay for in advance, and you can show off by not having to pull money out of your pocket in front of the girlfriend and just swipe your arm past this little, infrared thing.
Well, I saw a story just 2 weeks ago where this large chip company has started chipping the babies in the hospitals, and of course, it's a little band they put on their leg and said, it's right out of the womb, we put this band on, so therefore there'll never, ever, ever be a problem with baby swapping or losing a baby, and, you know, and so they've already conditioned the young couples.
The people, too.
Yeah, this is a wonderful thing. I'm going to be absolutely guaranteed this is my baby, and, you know, the medical record's right there for anybody who comes in and checks on it, and, I'm so much better, thank you.
That's right, and the British government and other governments have already said that they will implant. It's always the same two groups to begin with. It's the very young and the elderly. The most powerless you go for first.
Yeah.
And they've said that they're going to implant all those who possibly have Alzheimer's with a chip. That's going to be law.
Let's talk about HAARP a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know about HAARP? And because some folks who know about it say, oh yeah, that's that Tesla experiment up in Alaska. He's going to cook the ionosphere and maybe free electricity for us all. But they've got over, 44 installations of these things now?
There's over 54, 57, I think, that they admit to. And they have them. They can coordinate them all together and hit any place on the planet or a whole continent if they wish.
But these are multi-use machines, from what I understand, because my little fraction of knowledge about them is that they can alter weather, they can focus destruction beams on anywhere in the world they want, and also for mind control.
Yes, it's so for their point of view, it's a wonderful tool, and so, it's an old technique. They put a lot of money into it, and they've already admitted that they put their faith in science to control the world and the populations, and they mean it. And this HAARP technology, literally, as I say, it's signed into a treaty at the United Nations. Everyone should look it up. Signed in the 1970s. It can also cause earthquakes with it, tsunamis with it, droughts in it for warfare purposes, or flooding for warfare purposes.
And that's a great way to extort a nation. And
that's happening. They're using it. If you go through the shortwave bands, you can actually get over 20 places where the HAARP is being used 24 hours a day now. That started about 6 years ago. And I have them all written down here. I have all the frequencies. And so what it also can do is carry a secondary carrier signal which can pulse at the same frequencies as a human brain. That's also documented in the treaty at the United Nations, and they can make whole populations either very aggressive, very passive, or anxious. So that is all work. It's not a trial and error thing. It's down to fine art now.
I've had listeners over the years call the station and talk about tunnels. And they go, oh yeah, there's alien bases, there's super military stuff in there, they're underground. And I was brainwashed, I was conditioned, and I poo-pooed them off. I go, yeah, right. And then when I was listening to you the other day, and you talked about a machine that is owned by the RAND Corporation that's currently up in Greenland.
Oh, they have many of them.
That can dig, I don't know what diameter, but dig a tunnel of 5 miles an hour?
An hour, yeah.
Well,
5 miles an hour through any kind of rock.
And at what diameter are we talking about here? What?
The largest one they let the public know about. And remember, this thing passes through, and also it melts rock, and it will solidify behind the machine and cause a casing. So it's all in one. It forms all those purposes. You could actually put in 2 railroad tracks side by side, going together, one way and the other. When it passes.
So how big is this network here on the North American continent?
We have no idea, except they've had these things since at least the end of World War II. You see, scientists it's the greatest thing. They've done a very good job in the last almost 15 to 20 years in convincing us that they'll let us know all the latest technology and science they have. That's the biggest lie ever.
Here's your iPod.
And so we forget during the Cold War, people were getting killed and assassinated if they knew too much about high military secret technologies. And they've always kept the higher technologies secret from the people. The trick is to make the people convinced that they are being told about the latest attempts at whatever cloning or electrical technologies. That's the trick, is to convince us, and that's why they fund these big magazines like Popular Science. And the average reader will think, well, I know it all. I know what they're capable of doing. No, you're not. You're kept in the dark. That's the purpose of Popular Science.
I've heard that whatever we see, the military's had 60 years before.
I'd say even longer, I'd say even longer.
But I mean, think of the money, the old industries that keep going. If we've got tunnel-making machines here that can be mass-produced, and I mean, just what's it cost now? $20 million a mile to build a stupid ancient highway?
Well, yeah, because we live in such a corrupt system, and that again is another thing we have to understand. What we see at the bottom, and we call corruption, is normal practice above higher levels.
And we all know we can get hydrogen from water. I mean, it's there, the technology. We've all seen the machines. We've all seen the cars run on it. Why are we still going down this asinine path of oil?
That's because it was never intended to. When they gave us the car, they already had planned a whole 100 years of because I say the world is just a business plan. They'd already planned where they would take the world, and they did not want people. They wanted people to travel, build up the factories, etc., for a short period while they financed through their taxes this global takeover and armies, etc. But they also wanted at the end to create a world society of collective society, city-states. Now they call them habitat areas. They don't want people to have cars in the very near future. So that's why they never gave you any other technology.
Oh, I just saw it in today's morning paper out here in little Podunk, Montana. You know, somebody wants to build 700 houses on 80 acres, you know, little postage stamp lots, cluster housing. You don't need big yards anymore. We'll all pack you together. We'll have this little open space for you over here. It'll be wonderful. It's all Agenda 21.
It is. Agenda 21, and even that's not the final solution to them. It's a stepping stone. We're conditioned like you train rats step by step. Once you accept one step, it's easier to accept the next step. It seems quite natural, and it's evolving. That's how we think. And so the habitat areas at the United Nations, and you've got to go into the United Nations and Agenda 21, and they state right there that the world they are creating will eventually have no private property. There'll be habitat areas. There'll be no private transportation. Only essential vehicles only.
And you'll need passes to go from city to city.
You'll need passes, permission, and so on. And again, this is all a control mechanism for a small elite who will not be brain chipped, a small elite who will have the freedom to travel the whole world and go hunting in the bush when they want to by helicopters dropping them off and picking them up.
Now, let's get back to the immediate short-term plans here for the United States. This Middle Eastern war has been long since planned. The next step is Iran and Syria, and it is planned to break us militarily, expend our resources, financially bankrupt us, which is happening daily, probably at a more accelerated rate than anybody wants to realize.
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve note is crashing around the world. If we can't finance the war or finance our day-to-day debt here in this country, we'll be begging for a new central banker's currency. Instead of having our Congress do the right thing and coin our own money like they're supposed to, I see this thing happening within months and months, not decades.
It depends how see, China it was decided in the 1930s they would build China up. And you'll find this in the books of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs, that they'd use the U.S. right through to the end of the millennium and into the new. And then they would be planning the process of a new superpower, China, to take over as policeman of the world for another temporary phase. So that's true. The U.S. has a particular function for a particular period of time, and then they go down. They will go down as they're finishing off the Middle East.
Now, as this plan pans out and it comes to fruition for them, that will be the time, I think, when they decide, okay, let's get rid of the labor force that brought us here because we just don't need them now. We got what we wanted.
And they're afraid of too many people. See, they can't keep giving us a service economy, which we're on now. We're on a service economy, and we don't produce things anymore. And the big economists at the beginning of this whole service economy idea admitted themselves that it's like going into water and dog paddling until you couldn't paddle any further. It was not intended to keep going forever. It can't. And therefore it will go down. It's a temporary stopgap as you go down. I
try to explain that to my friends. I said, here's our usefulness as a nation. We're consumers and producers. We produce, we consume. We produce, we consume. Mm-hmm. We no longer produce. And all of our consuming is based on credit. Mm-hmm. Whether it's your car, your house, your Monkey Ward's bill, your Visa, your credit card, you're living paycheck to paycheck, everything we're buying from China and importing is on credit. Now, once the world quits issuing us credit, we're done.
Yes.
We can't produce, we can't consume, we crash.
Yeah. And that's the agenda. You see, that those at the top have always been globalists, no matter where they're born. And these top families that you think, even the ones in Britain, the English folk, the ordinary English people think, well, they're ours. They're our kings and queens and nobility. No, they're not. They're internationalists. They've always been. They only marry their own cousins from abroad. You know. In fact, they've never married into the populations that they actually dominate and preside over. So, no, they've always been internationalists, and they've never seen their world as a local world at all. It's always been an international world. The trick was to make us, who are tribal-based, think that we're still nations.
Yeah, and then Kissinger and his boys, as Brinsky and Rockefellers, are all getting ready to push legislation this August to introduce the Security and Prosperity and Peace Agreement for North America, which is the North American Union.
Yeah.
And even that, people think, they'll let us still have our little flag. We can still have our little national anthem and go to our baseball games. Mm-hmm. But the shadow government's going to be completely integrated. The corporate world.
Actually, it already is.
Yeah, it is.
It already is. I mean, it has been since even World War I and President Wilson. That's when it really came out more into the open. When they formed the League of Nations, the U.S. funded the setting up of the League of Nations. And Colonel Mandel House was the real boss behind Wilson. The president is never really the boss man. It's always a man behind him. And because he's the one who goes between the big bankers, the big internationalists, and back to the president. And Mandel House, his contact for London was Sir Earl Grey, who worked for the Royal Institute for International Affairs to set up this world system based on the colonial system of the British Empire.
Yeah, our audience is listening to Alan Watt. He runs the webpage cuttingthroughthematrix.net. I encourage all of you to support Alan, keep his fine work going for all of us. He's very helpful in this fight for the truth and peeling back the matrix. Go to his website at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. You can get his books there. You can get his DVDs there. Do not copy them and share them. This is the way Alan makes his money, and we've got to support people that are on our side that are trying to help us out through this. And Alan's got no other motive than getting the truth out here to as many people as we can to help mankind, not to sit back and profit and go, well, I got mine, I'm done, I'm going to retire. I mean, Alan truly lives the life. You live almost off-grid up in the northern Ontario, I believe it is, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm up in the north here. I'm still getting my wood in for the winter.
Now, one of our callers asked me to ask you a question about the significance, because these people trade in symbolism.
Yeah.
About us being in Babylon, where the final battle here is Babylon, which is i.e. Baghdad today.
Yeah, Babylon is an amazing, it's a cult terminology, really. And lion always comes from lion. And you also have the baby lion as well. And you also have the Bab, which is a high master. And they can literally take a system. See, Babylon was a system more than just a place. You can transfer that system elsewhere across the world and build up and take down empires and always move it to the next empire that you're building up. And that's what's been done down through history. When they move out of a country, they take their wealth with them, and down comes the country, and they've built up a new empire. What's interesting to me at the moment is that if you look into places like Bahrain, how heavily they're funding, the U.S. is funding Bahrain to build it up as the most modern place in the world. And even Halliburton, which is, as you know, is the only authorized global massive corporation to do rebuilding and restructuring across the planet. No one voted for this at the lower ranks. It's all the top guys who decided. So Halliburton's moved their headquarters from Texas to Bahrain. The Louvre in Paris is building a second Louvre, a pyramid-shaped one, like the glass one they have in Paris, over to Bahrain as well. And what's even more interesting is that H.G. Wells, who was an officially authorized propagandist for this system, wrote in one of his books about the final war, which would be a war where they'd even gas the public from the air on the shape of things to come. He said that the Freemasons of the air, the scientific brotherhood, would gas the people from the air to conquer the whole world, but they would use the place where they have the final war as eventually that will become their capital. So it's like from Babylon back to Babylon. That's what's so interesting, the circle of this. He even said in that book that eventually Britain, that the final war would begin in Basra, which is Iraq. It's a city, it's in the southern part of Iraq. And that's where the British troops went in. The US went to the north, and Britain went into Basra. So this was written in the 1920s. And you see, my good, well, he knew exactly the formula for the next 150 years or so. So it's from Babylon back to Babylon. And that's the symbology that's tremendously interesting about this, because the elite in all ages have never been massacred and fell and lost everything, and then a new elite takes over. They move from the empire they dominate to the next one that they're setting up, all down through history.
There was a broadcast last week on Rents, and Macau did the story about, I think it's William Bulford. He was the Forbes Asian editor of their magazine over there, basically giving a ultimatum to the Illuminati from the secret societies of China that said, you keep it up, we're taking you all out. Mm-hmm. How much credibility do you put in that?
I don't know yet. We have to wait and see what starts to happen. You'll know that if people start to get rubbed out, what's happening.
You know, when I read that story and I heard the interview, I didn't think it was really such a bad thing.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the sad thing, though. You see, we're dealing with people who are ruthless at the top. There's no doubt about that. If it takes killing millions, I mean, I remember when they were starving the ordinary people in Iraq during the 10-year period between Gulf War I and II. And Madeleine Albright, who, again, an incredible history. Her grandfather set up, while he was the top communist pal of Stalin. He was a very close friend of Stalin, her grandfather. And he set up the beginnings of the Green Party, which was to lead the world into this global government. And there she is, representing the United Nations, or the U.S. Department of the United Nations, and she was asked on national television, she said, and the guy said at that time that they'd killed about, 10,000, 20,000 Iraqis, men, women, and children through starvation. And I think it was even 500,000, 500,000. And without blinking or not, she was asked, do you think that's really worth the goal to make one man capitulate with his henchmen at the top? And she says, absolutely, without blinking an eyelid.
Unbelievable.
And that was the. You're looking at either something that's a demon talking back to you, or the ultimate psychopath beyond even the average psychopath.
I mean, here in America, we always like to think we're the good guys. We wear the white hats based on the propaganda history they've told us or led us to believe. Mm-hmm. And they don't tell us, some of the real war crimes that are going on through Eisenhower and prison camps and Agent Orange and all that kind of nonsense. But they know for a fact that this depleted uranium that we're spreading all over the globe over there, and it gets into the atmosphere, it gets into the dust, into the lungs, it is killing people by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, deforming babies, and it's going to pollute that area and cause genocide for thousands of years.
It's very possible. And on the other hand, too, these characters at the top who think primarily of their own survival at all 8 times and ages have already created massive underground bases for survival for themselves, where they could live for another 1,000, 2,000 years or more if necessary. They have done this, using our tax money again. Margaret Thatcher admitted that when she was Prime Minister. Because the Man Alive series in Britain, very much like 60 Minutes, and here's a very important part I'll go into, it's all connected. There was supposed to be a pamphlet, a booklet, given to every British citizen, or available from their post office or library, put up with the government, and it had the whole agenda of what to do if there was a bombardment by radiation in a city or cities, or bacterial or viral warfare. And all NATO countries signed the same agreement and supposed to have given every citizen a copy of this.
I didn't get my copy.
Yeah, well, eventually Man Alive had to get one from the government, and it was heavily censored and blacked out, this freely available copy, because in it stated that every signatory to NATO, and that includes the US and Canada and all the other countries, Here's the formula. If there's a biological attack or a viral attack in a city or a part of the country, the military is to surround that whole area. Any individual trying to escape the quarantine is to be shot on sight. If whole groups or mobs try to riot and break out, they're to be bombed by CS gas from the air. And no one is to be, and the whole lot is to be contained basically until they die. That's the NATO plan. And so then they went to Maggie Thatcher and they said, well, what's the plan for the elite? Because they'd found out that there was military bases underground that the elite were to be flown to immediately with Harrier jump jet and helicopter and picked up. And she says, well, we'll get in there. And she said, our families will be in there. And she was asked, well, what about the average person? She said, if they try to get in, our special troops or SS will shoot them down before they get in. I mean, this is on national television. You see, these guys, we're dealing with monsters at the top. We are scum to them.
But see, they've also had to draft or recruit the special op forces from, the masses here. They must have, when you think about, okay, how could this massive building of tunnels go on in America involving crews of 50, 60,000 people and having military guys guard them day and night? How come the story's not getting out? I mean, what kind of mind control brainwashing have they done on these people where they think it's a good thing to keep it from us?
Well, they showed us again a documentary special on how they did Cheyenne Mountain in the U.S., where the big military base is. And they literally hollowed out a whole mountain.
Yeah.
And they built a railroad track going up to it to take all away the dirt. And yet, when you go into it, all the higher contractors, etc., which is part of the beauty of bringing in outsiders always. They can bring in foreigners and different people from all over the globe to do the contracting and the work, and then send them back to their own countries. They ask no questions, they don't think any further, and it's lost. It's not difficult to keep massive projects quiet from the public.
Do you see warring fractions among the world elite? Say, for instance, the Rockefellers may be pissed off at the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds say, you know what, we're going to finish you off and destroy your little Federal Reserve notes here.
I don't see really that kind. There's more cooperation amongst them because they know that money is just a con game anyway. It's only important that we believe that it's useful and accept it as the only way to live. It's their trick. It's a means to an end for the elite. Eventually, we've all to be given credits. They've said this in the big books for the United Nations. Every citizen, when there's no private property, will be allocated so many credits at the beginning of every week into your bank account, and you can't save them up. So even if you don't use them all up, you'll start again with the same amount on Monday. And if you don't go along with the system or you become a problem, you'll be punished by having withdrawal of credits, which you can't pay your rent or buy your food. It's to be used as a tool for punishment.
Wow. We are on the air with Alan Watt. He's got a website called Cutting Through the Matrix. You've been on every major radio station that I know of, and websites and interviews for newspapers. And I encourage all of our listeners to we haven't even scratched the surface here with Alan's knowledge and wisdom that he wants to share with you. So please get his DVDs, his books. Let your kids read them, let your parents read them. We got to keep supporting folks that are helping us in this battle here. Now, Alan, we're getting ready to take off here, and I've had you on for about an hour and a half uninterrupted, which I think is great. One of, I think, the biggest fears, and I may just be, having unbased hope here, I think one of their biggest fears is that we are waking up. We may be forming a resistance to them. There may be some of us who have not taken as much fluoride or breathed as deep or putting those chemicals in our skin and our body. Is there hope for a resistance of a grand awakening where we call bullshit on this whole thing?
I don't think it's a grand awakening, to be honest with you. Most people are too far into a scientifically designed conditioning to break through. Most people will find it impossible to believe that they're absolute monsters in charge of them. They've been trained to believe these are the good guys. And they cannot believe that people are so evil. We judge people on an individual level as to how we could manage things. We can imagine a little white lie or whatever, or a little bit of deception, but we can't imagine something so horrible as the subject as we're talking about today, and people actually planning this cold-bloodedly, and yet that's the only reason they do get away with this kind of thing. So most people know they will not wake up, and it does boil down to an extent on a personal choice. I want to believe I'm being well taken care of, and it's also true that lots of people will love socialism as long as they think there's experts taking care of all the big problems for them, so they can go and play forever like little children.
I get my pension.
Yeah, that's it. And so it's not up to big amounts of people. It's up to people who are awake to start vocalizing their knowledge and creating ripples around them until all these little these ripples start to merge with other ripples. That's how you start a movement, but it has to be done very quickly.
It has to be done quickly, so there is hope out there for us. I don't think things are going to change too much. I think the plan's going to play out, and then we pick up the pieces from there.
Yes. It will, have no doubt about it, and they're on a roll right now, and they can't stop now. They know if they stop and give us a breathing space from terror, we'll fall back to sleep. And this remember, terrorism, and Carl Quigley said the main purpose of war is to change societies on all sides. He said because government expands massively its powers over the control of every individual during warfare.
That's
what we're seeing, you see.
Is there anything our listeners can do on a daily basis to stop the mind control, or is there some way to unplug something? I mean, I loved one of your sayings the other day, I think it was you, that if... No, it was somebody else. It was Lindsey Williams, who said if Jesus were alive today, he would go into the Federal Reserve and unplug the mainframe.
Yes, well, the thing is, I mean, we don't even need the Federal Reserve. It's just a building. It's just it's a con. But you don't even really have a treasury. You know?
No, we don't.
It's just a con, and what we have to do is to
turn off
primarily
TV.
Is to get through to the children. See, this is a long-term strategy.
Yep.
And Rumsfeld said it himself. This could be 100 years war. So if it takes 100 years to bring this new society into the making of total control, they're willing to go that far, which means they're already working on the minds of the children, which they plan to own. They want to own the minds.
You know, see, here in Montana, there's a lot of families that homeschool their kids.
Yeah.
And the brightest, most smartest, intelligent kids I've ever met in my life. I mean, they are university grade level at 14.
Yeah.
And they're always trying to pass laws to make it, to criminalize teaching your own child. Like, oh, you're abusing the child. You know, you're not having social engineering here. You're not giving enough Prozac, and you know, you report to the school anyway.
Yeah.
So they do work.
And most parents, as you know, who send their children off to school, is two-parent working families. They don't have time for their children, and many of them even expect the state to entertain their children for them and give them playgrounds after school and ball games and so on. It's almost like they're incidental to each other. There's no real communication. And unless the parents get involved and realize the responsibility that they do have to continue, it's not just the life that you know of. I'm talking about that is you're continuing the ability of the beauty of the individual thought or thinker. You see, that's what they're about to distinguish or extinguish, is to destroy that ability to be an independent thinker who appreciates the beauties of the world, of people, and all the better things of life. They want to destroy that.
What can we expect out of Alan Watts here in the coming weeks and future? Have you got a new book underway? You got some more DVDs?
I have. I'm so sure. Well, I'm a one-man band here, and it's kind of there's a lot of work involved even in this. And believe you me, if I wasn't motivated through an imperative to do this, I'd choose something else. But there's no choice. We're at the end of a particular road, and I think we all have a responsibility to change this, and no matter what it takes, and it means burning into the ground, and so be it, because evil like this cannot be allowed to continue.
Alan, we're here for you anytime you want. The radio station's at your disposal. We hope to get you back on in the future. I truly appreciate you sharing your valuable time with us here, and I want all of our listeners to at least visit the website, cuttingthroughthematrix.net. If you can't afford it, please purchase his DVDs and books. It'll help Alan out, and the more information that we can get out to all of us, the better we are going to be. It's knowledge and wisdom is probably going to be our only tools to survive this, if we can. Alan, thank you so much for joining us here on KGZ.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad we finally hooked up.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Whoa. Marathon. Got to take the break.
Alan, are you there?
Yes, I am, yeah.
I can't believe the difficulty we had this morning.
It's pretty standard.
It was so odd. I'm dialing the number that, it's saying it's out of order, and I forwarded it to the program director. And I said, could you figure this thing out? And between my computer and her computer, the number changed.
Really? Yeah, okay.
That's weird.
Yeah, well, I picked up the phone when I realized it was after 10 past, and to phone you, and I had there's someone else on the phone, and I hadn't dialed anywhere, and it didn't ring here,
I think they're trying to put the squeeze on us, Alan.
Yeah, it's pretty common.
They're watching us everywhere, aren't they?
Well, they are, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, I've been telling folks you were one of the foremost experts, historian and researchers on the secret societies and Illuminatis, and you go all the way back to the beginning of dirt on this stuff.
Yeah, you have to. It's not a recent thing to control vast populations of people. It's been recorded from ancient times and taught to the high courts of kings and queens down through the ages. And it simply got much, much bigger and more refined when it went into large governments with bureaucracies and secret services like the CIA and these kinds of things. So society has always been planned ahead of time, because those in power literally plan the future. They don't want to lose control, but they must convince the public that they're on the cutting edge of evolution with each generation, and it never dawns on them then that every major thing that happens in their life has actually been planned ahead of time. That's why it works so well. Yeah.
The earliest mind control guy, was it Nimrod? Or
it goes back even further.
Okay.
It depends even whose histories you take, because in India probably has the oldest histories in their archives, because every country has archives as opposed to public libraries.
Governments like to keep records.
They do, because if something works and a formula works, then you never change the formula, but you don't want the public to know that you have the formulas, because even Plato himself talks about the techniques of creating cultures for whole peoples and whole countries, and how it was well understood in his day, and how nothing would be allowed to happen in the culture that would upset the dominant minority, the rulers, and therefore the dominant minority had to employ great thinkers, great philosophers. In his own memoirs, and it's very flippant for those who don't understand history. It's very important, a little quip, and that's how history is made or missed. He said, "We have set up in the Middle East another Ulster." Now, Ulster in Ireland was set up by London to cause frequent dissension and troubles down through to the present century in Ireland with the Protestants and the Catholics, using religion primarily as a motive of war and eventual takeover. It was to keep a constant pot boiling and simmering that the whole world would feel the effects of. And that's how far back we're talking, 1920s.
I think Samuel Adams said fear is the foundations of most governments.
It is.
And then you hit on something that was very profound for me. It's like governments fear peacetime.
Yes, they do. They admit themselves that the first reason for government existing is to protect the rest of the little people, even in a tribal situation, from those guys over there, across the other side of that pond that you drink out of. And so the biggest guy in the tribe was picked. Now your problem then is if you start spoiling the big guy, and he has to drop back down into your way of living, your standards of living, he might not like it. But at least a tribe could overcome one person And that's why the tribal system, it was easier. He couldn't get a standing army together until money came along. And also, money was the key to standing armies.
And also the little guy, like we can equate to the middle class, that once you start to gain cash or affluence or spare time, you can do positive things with that, whether you want to run for office or you want to do charity work or start buildings. You become wealthier and wealthier and becomes a threat to them.
It becomes a threat, and that's why people think that and we're all trained. You see, the whole world, when you think of a whole world trained to use this thing called money, which is really a trick, because once they bring money in, they can tax it back from you. And the word tax means to labor. You tax yourself when you labor. Now, they take part of your labor back, then they employ more people, and as long as everyone believes in this money, you can hire armies, whole armies, and police, and think tanks to keep the people dominated. Money is the key to it. Yeah.
I think there was a quote from one of the old Rothschild patriot women that said, "Wars don't start unless my boys want them to start."
Government for at least 60 years, and that was in the 1960s.
Wow.
And he talked about the whole agenda. He filled in all the little blank spots of what led up to wars and what was behind them, and admitted that he and his group and other groups that belonged to the same circle worked in concert to bring on these wars, and they laid out the plans for the whole global empire for the future. And it's not just the politicians that they bring in, certain politicians. It's also a vast amount of your higher bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats are more important, and they have been since World War I with the League of Nations. Now, because then the bureaucrats have lifelong positions in particular offices and departments, and they bypass the government and go straight to their headquarters, which is now the United Nations.
We're on the air with Alan Watt. You can go to his website at cuttingthroughthematrix.net, and you've got 3 books out right now, or a 3-volume set. Cutting through the volumes 1, 2, and 3. It's available for our listeners out here. Go onto his website. You can order it directly. He also has DVDs you'll never think the same. And one of the things we're doing down here, Alan, is that we have embarked on an agenda here at the station. I own it. Mm-hmm. We're a little small station here, but we're the most powerful station in the Northwest up here. That I sense the time is very, very short, and we have now got to get the information, get the truth out here as fast as possible. And that's one of the reasons we wanted you here on the show, is like we're trying to lift the matrix that everybody's been under here. And it seems like we're finding out every core belief we've had or every political thought has been a lie.
Yes, it has. It truly has. I mean, I was discussing with some people about the problems with the Middle East and why it's going on. And I said, you have to go back into the memoirs of British officials, sort of consular generals, people that were put in charge of whole countries that the British Empire set up a long time ago, and read their own memoirs. And you'll find, for instance, that Sir Ronald Storrs, S-T-O-R-R-S, was the lieutenant governor. He was put in charge of the British takeover of the country called Palestine back in the 1920s and 30s in preparation for the creation of a state of Israel. Yeah, and what he said, a better cover called democracy in most of the countries. And democracy is a favorable thing. Plato talked about it in 2,300 years ago. He said this system, this perfect utopia for the elite, the guardian class he called them, will use a form of the republican democracy. And because democracy, you can always count that 80% of the people will do what the elite want them to do, and therefore they'll pretend it's majority rule. But 80% will do what they're told to do. That's what it really meant.
It's so obvious today. I mean, there was just a vote in our U.S. Senate yesterday. I think it was 99-0 about basically reprimanding Iran and saying, if you continue to fund bad guys over there, we're not going to like it. And he's like, no debate. It's like they turned on the mist machine and they all went to sleep, or they're all under some sort of gigantic mind control. And I thought, well, that's the most worthless bill or stupid thing I've ever heard in my life. And it's a 100% vote?
I know, and this is the thing too. We've got to realize that there's consensus behind the scenes through societies within government. All major politicians, if they've stayed in government for more than one term, even in the lower ranks, they're allowed into a higher parallel rank, where they're told part of the agenda, and they must agree to abide by the rules of the decisions made by their superiors. And so they vote the way they're told to vote. Professor Carl Quigley, wrote about this in his book Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American Establishment. Now, he was authorized to pick people to be Rhodes Scholars for world government. That was the purpose of the Rhodes Scholarships. He picked Bill Clinton, amongst others. And he was the official historian for the Council on Foreign Relations, this parallel group that actually they drafted up all the plans for the American integration, this non-governmental organization. and they are simply the American branch of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. That's the British Commonwealth branch. And so it's run from London. And he wrote about this, and he was all for it. He was part of them. He was a member. And he said then in the 1960s in his book, he said the United States government has been run by parallels and people within academy to always update and help modify the culture from the top down. Yeah, and that's what we've had mainly in this. It was great to live in the 70s and the 80s and watch the tail end of the pop rock culture, and how it was really pushed from the top by multi-billionaires, really. It wasn't a grassroots thing at all.
We always think it's our idea, don't we?
We do. Yeah.
Now, one of the best ways to control civilization, and I've always suspected this, was through an omnipresent God. If you're going to be around government controls, say you're going to live out in the country or whatever, well, there's always that fallback thing that, there's a God watching you, and so you just better go ahead and pay your taxes. And I think the early kings or the Masons or the echelon, I guess, the elites, figured this out, that, hey, to keep these people in line and not overthrow me, one, they got to think I'm connected to the gods, or I am a god myself, and I'm everywhere, and you can't overthrow me because I'm here to protect you. I'm a wonderful guy, and protect you from invasion. But you guys got to pay attention, and that way you won't kill me when I come and ask for your gold.
Yes, and that came even. The structure existed before the days of Sumer. There's no doubt about that. The Sumer really was a sort of, I would call it, more modern prototype of the present-day society. And they obviously had the knowledge from previous civilizations, the Hurrian civilization that existed before that. So we're going back 10,000 years, 15,000 years.
Now, it just seems so hard to wrap your hands around a dynasty or families that can stay in power behind the scenes and control nations, control money supplies, control wars, control famines. And it's like, no, people really aren't that evil. Or how come they haven't interbred, and how come we're not seeing this?
Yes, and that's the technique again. Kings and queens always had front people to speak for them. It's no different from today. Today we have governments to speak really for an elite, and we're taught to believe that governments are in charge. So the governments take the heat off the real rulers. That's the job of the front men. And Britain, they always had a chancellor or something before that for a king, and he would take the heat for all the decisions that were made because the king was above all of that, you see. He was a nice guy, and it kept him a nice guy. So that the chancellor would take the heat. So it's the same thing in all ages. Today we have